All right, so first question here. What gives bone its flexibility? Well, remember, bone has inorganic components and organic components. The inorganic components are going to be the hydroxyapatite crystals, and that's mostly made up of calcium and phosphate. But the organic components are going to be collagen and the semi-solid ground substance of proteoglycans and glycoproteins. And this is what's going to give bone tensile strength and contribute to its flexibility, okay? Next, what is the periosteum composed of? Well, remember that the periosteum has an outer layer and an inner layer. And the outer layer is going to be made up of dense, irregular connective tissue, while the inner layer is going to be made up of cells, those osteoprogenitor cells, the osteoblasts, and the osteoclasts, okay? And here's this outer fibrous layer here. And remember that it's dense, irregular connective tissue. Know the steps of bone calcification. Remember, this is where the osteoblast secretes osteoid, and the osteoid then calcifies, and then the osteoblast becomes a walled-in osteocyte. The osteon is the tubular structural unit of what? Well, not just bone, but in particular compact bone, okay? We see osteons in compact bone. Okay, know the steps of calcitriol production. So if you remember, we start with vitamin D3, which you get either through your diet or through transforming a precursor molecule into vitamin D3 with ultraviolet light in the skin. Then you take vitamin D3 and it goes to the liver where it's converted to calcidiol, and then it goes to the kidney where it's converted to calcitriol. So you need to know these steps of the production. Which type of cell produces new bone tissue? This should be pretty easy for you to remember. This is going to be the osteoblasts, and this is just kind of a simple definition question. Osteoblasts. You need to know the roles of an osteoblast and an osteoclast and what affects their activity. For example, mechanical stress is going to affect the activity of osteoblasts and osteoclasts because that mechanical stress is going to be communicated to the osteocytes, which are then going to tell, let's say, the osteoblasts to build more bone if there's more mechanical stress, okay? And remember, gravity is part of mechanical stress. Calcitonin and parathyroid hormone and blood calcium levels are also going to affect osteoblast and osteoclast activity, and you need to go back and review and be able to tell me, is increased blood calcium level going to increase osteoclast activity or decrease osteoclast activity? And the same with osteoblasts, and the same with calcitonin and parathyroid hormone, okay? You need to know the zones in an epiphyseal plate, and you need to know them in order. So the first zone is going to be the zone of resting cartilage, and remember this resembles mature hyaline cartilage. The second zone is going to be the zone of proliferating cartilage. This is where those chondrocytes divide rapidly and create these stacked columns of chondrocytes, and this is kind of how this is exactly how the bone grows, okay? This expanding area of cartilage, which is then going to go on to hypertrophy. The chondrocytes stop dividing in the zone of hypertrophic cartilage. Then it's going to calcify in the zone of calcified cartilage, and this destroys those chondrocytes that were there. And then in the zone of ossification, the bone matrix is going to be laid down on this calcified cartilage, okay? And that's how bone is formed through endochondral ossification, which is how most of your bones are going to be formed. What are the cells that produce cartilage called? This is another definition question, and you should know. This is going to be chondroblasts. What do canaliculi do? These are going to be those small kind of rivers between nearby osteocytes, and the canaliculi connect adjacent lacunae, providing a pathway for nutrients between those osteocytes, okay? How are most bones of the body formed? Well, I just mentioned it's going to be through endochondral ossification. Parathyroid hormone is going to be triggered by low or high levels of calcium in the blood. You need to know this. It's going to be triggered by low calcium levels. And why is that? It's because parathyroid hormone basically signals the bone to break down, to give up calcium so that there's more calcium available for the blood. And the reason it would do this is because it detects low calcium in the blood. Calcitonin is going to do the exact opposite of this. So you need to know the action of both of those hormones, okay? What are the rings of compact bone surrounding the central canal of each osteon called? Well, they're right here. Here are those rings, and they're called concentric lamellae. Is bone a storage reservoir? Yes, it is. And what it stores is calcium, phosphorus, that's in the actual bone tissue, and then in the yellow bone marrow, it stores adipose tissue or lipids, okay? You need to know the difference between flexion and extension. For example, clenching to make a fist is going to be flexion of the fingers, and then extending those fingers out, spreading your fingers out after making a fist, that's going to be extension. The interosseous membrane between the radius and the ulna is what kind of articulation? This is going to be a syndesmosis, okay? Remember, syndesmoses are bound by an interosseous membrane, which is a broad ligamentous sheet, and you're going to find it between the radius and the ulna and between the tibia and the fibula. It's going to function as an amphiarthrosis and provide a pivot point for two long bones, okay? So structurally, a syndesmosis is a fibrous joint, while functionally, it is an amphiarthrosis. All right, the TMJ is primarily what kind of joint? It's primarily a hinge joint, such as when you're chewing food. But it can also make gliding movements. So like when you protract your jaw or jut it forward, or if you jut it side to side in like grinding movements, those are gliding movements, okay? So the jaw can do both hinge movement and gliding movements. Where are gomphoses found, and what kind of joint is a gomphosis functionally? Well, recall that gomphoses can be found in the tooth sockets, specifically tooth sockets, okay? And functionally, it is a synarthrosis. There is normally no movement in the tooth socket, okay? Synarthrosis means no movement. Okay, the sutures are what kind of structural joints? They're going to be fibrous. In which kind of joints can an articular capsule be found? You've got to know this. An articular capsule you find in synovial joints. So go back and review synovial joints because there will be questions over them, okay? Which ligament holds the head of the radius in place? I want you to know this. This is the annular ligament. And remember, this is in nursemaid's elbow. What happens is the head of the radius slips out from that annular ligament. Okay, so a subluxation or a partial dislocation of the head of the radius. What is the structural and functional classification of the pubic symphysis? So you need to go back and look at all of those joints that were mentioned in lecture and really focus on their structural and functional classification for each joint. But I will tell you, for the pubic symphysis, structurally, it's going to be a cartilaginous joint, and functionally, it's going to be an amphiarthrosis. You need to know what makes up a synovial joint. So you've got your articular cartilage, you've got the synovial membrane, synovial fluid inside of that synovial cavity, and then blood vessels and sensory receptors. All of those make up an articular capsule, or excuse me, a synovial joint. You'll notice that I did not mention muscle at any point of that. So muscle is not a part of the synovial joint. Here's another definition question. The fixed point a lever rotates around is called the fulcrum. Okay. Which structures are reservoirs that store acetylcholine? Remember that it's the synaptic vesicles of the axon that are going to be reservoirs for acetylcholine. And remember that the terminal cisternae are what store calcium in the muscle cell. I need you to know the differences between fast twitch and slow twitch muscle fibers. So when I say fast twitch, I'm talking about fast glycolytic fibers, or type 2B. When I say slow twitch, I'm talking about slow oxidative fibers, or type 1 fibers, okay? So in type 1 fibers, the contractions are going to be slower and less powerful. There's going to be high endurance since ATP is supplied aerobically, and they're going to appear red due to large amounts of myoglobin. So these are going to be, your endurance muscles. Whereas the fast fibers are going to be, the contractions are fast and powerful but brief. ATP production is primarily going to be through anaerobic processes, okay, so glycolysis. And you're going to see, let's say in a sprinter, you would see a lot of fast glycolytic fibers, okay? They need a lot of movement, but for a brief period of time. So contractions are going to be fast and powerful, but brief. And the ATP is going to be supplied anaerobically. All right, I need you to know the molecular process of muscle contraction. So remember, an action potential travels down the axon of the neuron, and it reaches the synaptic knob. Then calcium channels are going to open up, and calcium is going to flood into the synaptic knob. What that's going to do is that's going to trigger the release, or the exocytosis, of acetylcholine. Acetylcholine is going to bind to acetylcholine receptors at the motor end plate on the muscle cell. Binding of acetylcholine at these receptors is going to open up sodium ion channels, and sodium is going to flood in quickly into the muscle cell. And potassium is going to leak out a little bit more slowly. So the influx of sodium is going to make the inside of this cell more positive, and that's going to trigger an action potential or depolarization of the sarcolemma. And this depolarization is going to travel down the sarcolemma and down those T tubules, right, into the muscle cell, deep into the muscle cell, to trigger release of intracellular calcium from the sarcoplasmic reticulum. That intracellular calcium is then going to bind to troponin. Troponin is going to change its shape, which is going to move tropomyosin out of the way of the thin filaments, the myosin binding sites on the actin of the thin filaments. Okay. Myosin heads, which are in the cocked position, are going to bind to the exposed myosin binding site on actin then, and form the cross bridge between myosin and actin. Then you're going to have the power stroke, where the myosin head swivels toward the center of the sarcomere, pulling the attached thin filament along with it. ADP and inorganic phosphate are going to be released during this process. You need to know that. You need to know when ADP and inorganic phosphate are released. Next, ATP is going to bind to the ATP binding site on the myosin head. You need to know that. And you need to know that that's going to cause the release of the myosin head from the binding site on actin. And then ATP is going to be split into ADP and inorganic phosphate by myosin ATPase, and this is what's going to provide the energy to reset the myosin head, okay? So it gets cocked again. Okay, so what has to happen for relaxation to occur? I want you to know this. The sarcoplasmic calcium levels are going to fall. Calcium is going to be removed from troponin, and tropomyosin is going to move back into position where it blocks the myosin binding sites on actin, okay? Okay, the type of muscle fibers that are striated, so right there we know it's not smooth muscle, form Y-shaped branches and join at intercalated discs. This is going to be cardiac muscle, and you've got to know these characteristics of cardiac muscle. It's going to come up again and again and again, so go ahead and learn it. What is the branch of the nervous system that governs smooth muscle contraction? This is going to be the autonomic nervous system. Okay, the autonomic nervous system. Here's another definition. What is the space between the motor neuron and the skeletal muscle fiber at a neuromuscular junction called? So the space between the motor neuron, so between the synaptic knob and the motor end plate, that's going to be the synaptic cleft. Okay, what does a motor unit consist of? Oh, excuse me, hold on. Which property returns muscle to its original length after a contraction ends? Well, go back and review the properties of muscles, and you'll see that this is elasticity. What does a motor unit consist of? A motor unit consists of a single motor neuron, so just one neuron, and the multiple muscle fibers it innervates. So you can see here you have a single motor neuron and it's innervating 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different muscle fibers here that we can see. How does parathyroid hormone affect calcitriol production and calcium excretion in the kidneys? Okay, so you just need to go back and look at the effects of parathyroid hormone and be very familiar with them. But I will tell you, parathyroid hormone is going to increase calcitriol production and decrease calcium excretion. Why? This is because the overall effect of parathyroid hormone, what it wants to do is it wants to increase blood calcium levels. And the way you do that is you can increase calcitriol and decrease calcium excretion. So decrease how much calcium you're losing in the kidneys. Okay. More definitions. Compact bone is also called cortical bone. And spongy bone can also be known as cancellous bone or trabecular bone. So you've just got to know, you got to be familiar with all of these different definitions. Where does hematopoiesis occur? You should know this. This is in the red bone marrow. Is bone vascular or avascular, and what kind of neurons does it contain? Well, recall that cartilage is avascular, but bone is very vascular. Bone itself is very vascular. And the kind of neurons it's going to contain, well, this should make sense. It's going to contain sensory neurons and not motor neurons, okay, because there's nothing in the bone to move. The movement is going to come from muscle cells, okay? So sensory neurons are going to be what's contained in bones. Which bone cells break down bone? That should tell you right there. It's going to be osteoclasts. And how do osteoclasts do it? They secrete hydrochloric acid and enzymes. What is the membranous network that wraps around myofibrils and holds high concentrations of calcium? Well, I mentioned it before, but it's going to be the sarcoplasmic reticulum. So this is the sarcoplasmic reticulum. You can see it's this network here, and it joins into these tubes called the terminal cisternae. And this is one giant calcium storage site for the muscle cell. You need to know the structure of a sarcomere, okay? And you need to know what the different bands are called. So here's the sarcomere. Know that the dark bands are going to be your A bands. The light bands are going to be the I bands. Okay. Know what the Z discs are, and know that a sarcomere runs from Z disc to Z disc. And correlate it to the actual proteins that are in the sarcomere. Okay, so Z disc is going to be where the actin filaments, the thin filaments bind. The M line is going to be where the thick filaments connect. The A band, or the H zone is going to be where there's only thick filaments. The I band is there's only thin filaments, and the A band is there's going to be overlapping of thick and thin filaments, okay? What proteins are found in actin filaments? You've got the string of actin proteins, and then you've got the long tropomyosin molecule that blocks those myosin binding sites on actin. And then you've got the troponin molecule. You need to know the difference between multi-unit and single-unit smooth muscle. Smooth muscle tissue in which cells are individually sent signals to contract is going to be your multi-unit, okay? And multi-unit muscle is going to be more for fine-tuning, small movements. You're going to see multi-unit muscle in smooth muscle in your iris of your eye, for example, to precisely control the diameter of the pupil. You've got to know the difference between a ligament and tendon. You should know this by now. A tendon is going to connect muscle to bone, while a ligament is going to connect bone to bone. The neurons that stimulate muscle contraction, these are motor neurons, motor muscle, okay? Any neuron that stimulates a muscle to contract is a motor neuron. And then I've got the answer here for you. The thick filament is made up of myosin. Okay, so that's all for exam 3. It's largely definitions, guys. Largely definitions. So go through your PowerPoints. Make sure you know all of those definitions that are mentioned. There might be a few that I didn't put in this review, so make sure you check and are very familiar with the definitions in this unit. And then muscle contraction is going to be a big one that you need to go back and review and make sure you're very familiar with every step of the process, from when the acetylcholine is released from the synaptic knob all the way to when the muscle relaxes. Okay, know every single one of those steps. And as always, shoot me an email with any questions you may have. I'm always happy to help.